Okay, I want you to just picture this scene for a second. It's the evening of July 20th, 1969. The tension inside this cramped, dusty little lunar module is absolutely palpable. I mean, two men have literally just finished making history by taking the very first human steps on the surface of the moon, right? And back on Earth, something like 650 million people are celebrating. But inside that tiny metal box, sitting dead center in the Sea of Tranquility, a really terrifying realization is just starting to dawn on them. So what happened? Well, you see, when Neil Armstrong was trying to squeeze his incredibly bulky, heavy spacesuit back through the insanely tight exit of the lunar module, he accidentally bumped the wall. Now, without the medium of air, sound doesn't travel in space, so neither astronaut actually heard a thing. But that one accidental bump broke a really small, absolutely critical piece of equipment, the ascent engine arming switch. Without that specific switch, their lunar module couldn't take off. They were, quite literally, stranded. And this wasn't just some theoretical worry. The danger was so undeniably real that back on Earth, U.S. President Richard Nixon actually had an alternate speech prepared just in case they couldn't get that engine to fire. The speech opens with these chilling words. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon will stay on the moon to rest in peace. It's just a sobering reminder that a safe return was absolutely never guaranteed. Section 1. The Ultimate Cold War Prize. Okay, let's dive into this. To truly understand the sheer audacity of this entire mission, we have to look at the intense geopolitical pressure cooker that practically forced it into existence. This wasn't just a mission of scientific curiosity, It was a high-stakes battleground. The US and the Soviet Union were locked in the Cold War, and America was, frankly, decisively losing the space race. In 1957, the Soviets successfully launched Sputnik. Then, in April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the very first human in space. The Americans were absolutely shocked. And then, just weeks later in May 1961, President John F. Kennedy makes this bold, seemingly impossible promise to land an American on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. I mean, think about it. At a time without smartphones, the internet, or even GPS, this was a monumental leap of faith. To turn that kind of audacious promise into reality required a staggering mobilization of resources. NASA poured $24 billion into the Apollo program. To put that into perspective, that translates to over $100 billion today. But it wasn't just about the money. It required the relentless, around-the-clock effort of more than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians, all working under a completely crushing deadline. Section 2. The man behind the spacesuit. Now, we often talk about the massive scale of the Cold War, but the man chosen to lead this unbelievable endeavor, a 38-year-old commander named Neil Armstrong, actually carried a profound personal tragedy. In January 1962, he and his wife Janet lost their 2-year-old daughter, Karen, to a brain tumor. Armstrong was deeply loving but profoundly stoic. He rarely, if ever, spoke of her death, basically pouring all of his grief directly into his work. In fact, his sister later suggested that it was the loss of little Karen that truly drove him to invest all his energy into the space program. That quiet stoicism and icy calm became his defining traits, and they absolutely saved his life prior to Apollo. During the Gemini 8 mission, a short-circuited thruster caused his spacecraft to tumble totally out of control at a dizzying rate of 1 full rotation per second. Armstrong was literally on the verge of losing consciousness, but he kept his cool, fired the re-entry thrusters early, and managed to stabilize the ship. That is exactly the kind of temperament you need when you're heading straight into the unknown. Section 3. 30 seconds to abort. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the road to the moon was incredibly dangerous, forcing NASA into this terrifyingly rapid testing phase as that end-of-the-decade deadline loomed closer and closer. The Apollo program was literally forged in the tragedy of Apollo 1 in January 1967, when 3 astronauts tragically died in a horrific cabin fire during a pre-launch test. But, NASA couldn't stop. They overhauled the spacecraft's design and just pushed forward at breakneck speed. By December 1968, Apollo 8 had orbited the moon, and just a few short months later, in July 1969, Apollo 11 was sitting on the launch pad. Once they actually launched and broke Earth's orbit, the mechanics required out there in the vacuum of space were like this wildly complex ballet.
The command module, piloted by Michael Collins, had to detach from the massive Saturn V rocket, physically rotate 180 degrees in space, and then dock with the lunar module, known as the Eagle. And without Collins executing this flawlessly, Armstrong and Aldrin would never even have had the chance to descend to the surface.
But the descent itself? It was a total nightmare. Just as the Eagle was preparing to land, blaring, completely unknown alarms began going off. 12:01 and 12:02, the Apollo guidance computer was severely overloading. Mission Control told them to ignore it and keep going, but as they got closer, Armstrong looked out the window and realized the automatic computer was trying to land them right in the middle of a crater filled with massive boulders. He had to instantly take manual control. He steered the ship away, desperately searching for a safe spot while his fuel gauge just plummeted. At 100 feet above the lunar surface, they had only 5% of their fuel remaining. Mission Control started a super tense countdown. Armstrong landed the Eagle with a terrifyingly low 30 seconds of fuel left before he would have been forced to abort the mission entirely. And this brilliantly illustrates Armstrong's incredible composure. Think about it, with his heart racing, having just narrowly avoided a deadly crash, and completely running out of fuel. He simply keyed his mic and calmly delivered those historic words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed."
Section 4. A pen saves the day.
So, remember the crisis we started this explainer with? That broken switch? Well, when they discovered the damage after their historic moonwalk, they realized a broken electrical circuit stood squarely between them and their survival. Without a completed circuit, the ascent engine simply could not fire, and they couldn't rendezvous with Michael Collins, who was orbiting high above them. Mission Control scrambled for a solution, but it was actually Buzz Aldrin inside the cabin who realized the answer. Since a switch basically just completes an electrical circuit, he realized he just needed something to bridge the gap. So, what does he do? He grabs a totally low-tech, everyday item, a simple ballpoint pen. He jams it right into the broken switch, completes the circuit, and successfully reignites the engine. I mean, a plastic pen literally saved the Apollo 11 mission. Incredible. Section 5. Debunking the moon hoaxes. Now, despite the sheer ingenuity, the tragedy, and the hard work of 400,000 people, many people still insist the whole thing was just some Hollywood fake. But the science easily puts these myths to rest. People point to the fluttering flag in a vacuum, right? But NASA actually designed a horizontal rod to hold the flag up, and the aluminum rods acted like springs, so they shook when the astronauts moved them, and then they stopped. What about no stars in the photos? Well, they landed during the lunar day. The extreme glare of the sun, combined with their highly reflective white suits, completely washed out the stars on the cameras. It's exactly like using a flash outside at night today. And those weird shadows? The moon's surface itself is highly reflective, acting as a secondary light source that scattered light in multiple directions. Boom. The science is absolute. Section 6. Returning to the lunar surface. Putting the myths aside, what actually matters is the incredible legacy they left on the lunar surface. And to understand that, we have to understand the dynamic between the two men who walked there. So the crucial point is that Buzz Aldrin was incredibly driven and actively lobbied to be the first man out of the module. Neil Armstrong, by contrast, had basically zero ego. NASA intentionally chose Armstrong for the first step because of that quiet humility. They knew for sure he wouldn't let his ego overshadow a moment that was really meant for all of humanity. And ironically, this dynamic meant that during their moonwalk, Neil was the one taking all the pictures. Because of that, there are almost no clear photographs of Neil Armstrong's face on the moon, just his back or his reflection in Buzz Aldrin's visor. But the impact of their 2.5-hour moonwalk went far beyond just photographs or a Cold War victory. They left behind a massive scientific legacy. They installed a passive seismometer to measure moonquakes, a device to measure solar winds, and even laser beam reflectors that we literally still use today to calculate the exact distance between the Earth and the Moon. They also brought back 23 kilograms of lunar rocks. Not to mention, the massive demand for the Apollo guidance computers helped drop the price of integrated circuits by 90%, which totally fueled the microchip revolution back here on Earth. Following Apollo 17 in 1972, no human has returned to the moon. But you know what? That is about to change, with NASA's new Artemis program actively preparing to send the first woman and the first person of color to the lunar surface. Before the end of this decade, we are looking at a brand new era of space exploration. So the question I'll leave you with today is this. Over 50 years after Neil Armstrong's humble first step, who will take the next giant leap for mankind?